Your organization is living somewhere inside of this diagram. Why? I'm here to tell you. So, a lot of times as leaders, we think change management fails because of a strategy or perhaps team members, etc. When in fact, it boils down to the two core human emotions. So, as humans, we all experience two core emotions. It doesn't mean that there's not plenty of other byproduct feelings and emotions as a result, but underneath, if we peeled back the layers, for example, over here, if we peeled back contentment, joy, peace, or over here we peeled back violence, rage, anger, whatever different byproducts, they're coming from these two places. So when we don't spend time in introspection, we sometimes miss these signals. So another layer to help us before we get to some deeper neuroscience I want to share with you all in this short explainer video, it's this physics lesson. The exact opposite of radiation is absorption. And so radiation is simply the outward emission and transmission of energy. So this often for physics, it happens in waves and particles, but it's from a source. And absorption is actually the process of energy being taken in and retained by a material rather than emitted or transmitted. So energy, it never dies, it only transforms. So that creative force and source energy that radiates, that's the positive transformation. This is when transformation is actually cut off if these are the hierarchical structures still existing, which we all see showing up in these human constructs, such as racial empire logic and patriarchal systems, etc. So we see this most replicated in the current workplace structures. Okay, so that's our little physics slash leadership lesson. But really, before we get into how these things are actually wiring in our brain for a leadership function, there's one other point I want to say before we get into that. And I help you learn a little bit more about how the brain processes change based on an environment of fear versus love. And so, in fear based leadership, what does this do to a team? It actually suppresses the prefrontal cortex function, which is creativity, innovation, collaboration. So, when the amygdala has chronically activated, that's going to be suppressed. And that means that people, we literally can't think as clearly, we can't innovate as freely or collaborate under those threats in the nervous system. It actually, when we have safety from love based leadership, psychological safety, which is really the neurological equivalent of a love based environment, the prefrontal cortex stays engaged and, in fact, it deactivates the neural pathways responsible for fear and social judgment. So, adaptive leadership is living inside of that. The ability to be adaptive lives within a leadership model based on love. And this gives us a bandwidth to see new perspectives, to regulate our emotions, and to also take measured and considered risks and guide others through uncertainty. So it doesn't just make our brains feel better, or it's not just like, oh, this feels so good and lovely. It's it's really a function at a higher level. And when we radiate outwards, it it's mirrored back to us. When we radiate fear outwards, that is also mirrored back to us. So without any more explaining of the bigger picture, that perspective, we're going to zoom in to perception and also what happens in the exact moments when we have things like the hormone cortisol released versus oxytocin and what that means. Stay tuned and hit subscribe. So let's go just a little bit deeper in this video, and we're going to discuss a little bit of the chemistry of each of these states that you see listed. And we're going to do it through the lens of fear-based versus love-based leadership. Everything starts with a fundamental neurological fork in the road, so to speak. So when a person perceives threat, the amygdala, your brain's smoke alarm, think of it that way, that hijacks our system, and this triggers what's called fight, flight, or freeze. So right now, we are talking about the amygdala. see if I smell it right, if I spell it right. And so when we as humans feel safe and connected though, the prefrontal cortex comes online and that enables our creativity, our empathy, our complex reasoning, and also our openness to change. And that's going to go right here. That's our prefrontal cortex. And this is important to understand how the brain functions from these different regions, because where are the key hormones? In fear-based leadership, we have that C word, cortisol, the stress release, whereas love-based, we get a release of oxytocin, which boosts our connection and trust in different environments and circumstances. So let's go to the nervous system state. This would then be sympathetic, which, like we just described from the amygdala acts like a smoke alarm. And then our sympathetic nervous system tells us there is a perceived threat. The parasympathetic actually tells us there is safety. So we talk about the conditions of even giving, for example, an employee engagement survey. What are the conditions? What are the communication messages that are being sent out energetically? How are they being messaged? Are we doing this in a low context way where we just send a one-off email to our employees, to our colleagues, right? Our colleagues and the humans that we work with. Let's look at what this looks like in our cognitive capacity then, or our bandwidth as I like to call it. Not necessarily capacity, but our bandwidth, because we might have like vast capabilities, but depending on the setting, I like to use the term bandwidth over capacity, because in more of like a decolonized way, bandwidth indicates at this moment where I'm at. So I do like that word over capacity, just personally. This will result in narrowed and reactive behaviors and or decision making, etc. Over here, this is going to be more expanded and creative, which leads to a lot of innovation. Oh no, I forgot the color coding. Expanded and creative. Okay. And the brain does work in colors often if you're able to see them. Also, then social behavior. So if you're in a social setting and you start to see these behaviors maybe from a colleague, just know there may be something, right, beyond just, oh, they're triggered. It could be a long-term buildup. Over here with love-based leadership, how the social behavior would show up is in collaborative and open ways. And finally, the overall response to change. Okay, this is going to turn out to be resistance and shut down. And this is going to be over here. Two key ingredients to sustainable transformation: curiosity and adaptability. Put your questions, comments, thoughts, theories, opinions, feelings in the comments. Thank you for tuning in to this little explainer video. If you have more ideas or want me to talk about more in-depth topics like this, be sure that you note it for me. I'm Justine Gonzalez, your hostess here at Love Learning You, and let's continue to get compassionately curious together.